If you haven't subscribed, so subscribe here. So this video is about language and how we use it. For many of us, language is just a medium of communication, and that's it. But language is more than that. Language is something we use to do things, not just to pass information. So some of you are familiar with the concept of discourse and probably discourse analysis. So discourse is a written text, a spoken word, or a debate. So that's discourse. And some scholars focus on those things. They focus on the text, they focus on spoken word, they focus on how people engage with one another through spoken word or through text. And what they do, they analyze them. And that concept is called discourse analysis. So the analysis of discourse. And the reason why they analyze discourse is because they know discourse is more than just means of communication. Because discourse can be used to do things. It can be used to hide the intent of the speaker in the discourse. So when someone speaks to people, they can obscure the intent within the language. So if you don't pay attention to the language, you might miss the meanings that are hidden. And the issue of discourse is now a big area of study, not just for linguists, because it used to be the province of linguists, but social scientists now, philosophers are engaged in discourse analysis. And the one who actually made it really popular, and he took discourse to a different level and used it differently, is the work of French philosopher Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault used discourse in a different way in works like Madness and Civilization, Order of Things, Discipline and Punish, the Archeology of Knowledge, The Birth of Clinic. So what Foucault is saying, there are some things we see, so things we read, things we are taught, and we are taught to see them as if they pre-existed. We read them, for example, as if they pre-existed. For example, if you are a student of physics or biology or chemistry, for example, if you don't read the history of these subjects, then you will assume they pre-existed. They always existed like that. But Foucault is saying these things were made up. They were someone else's discourse. They were constructed as discourses. And the reason why it's difficult for people to know that these were discourses is the way they've been constructed. So people don't look at the discursive element, but they only look at things as they've been presented. The most fundamental use of discourse is in power and in politics. So if you look at things, and what Foucault did, he looks at sexuality, for example, how society looks at sexuality. If you look at how people in the Victorian era looked at sex, was different from how it was maybe 100 to 100 years prior. During the Victorian era, people did not speak about sex openly. But in the previous generation, it was an open thing. People did not care. It was an open thing. But during the Victorian era, things became discreet. Society put down laws that govern sexuality. But now, if we look at issues of sexuality, they are really involved around taboos, around norms and things we follow, as if they've always been like this. They've never been like this. There were people, there were leaders, there were religious leaders, there were social leaders, political leaders who decided to say, okay, we are going to change how things are done. and they put down laws, and these laws were done through language, and that changes how you look at things. One of the easiest examples of how discourse affects, because the way you use language changes how people look at something. So look at the issue of demonstration, for example. In the US in January, when Trump supporters stormed the Capitol Hill, if you look at the left wing media, for example, MSNBC or CNN, and look at Fox News, for example, and other left wing, other right wing media, they describe the same people differently because they were catering to different audience, because they want those audiences to look at what they're saying differently. Fox News would call Black Lives Matter demonstrators as a mob, as anti-American. The left-wing media will see them as, people who have grievances. They're just regular Americans who are upset about their rights and racism. When it came to the right-wing demonstrators, Fox News said, oh, you know what, they are regular Americans who are angry about the election that has been stolen. The left-wing media said, oh, they are mob, they're anti-American, it was a coup attempt. So it's the same event, but they use the language differently. And the way you use the language is the way people, the audience, receive it. So there are some people who take language lightly. No, language is a big deal. It's something we use to do things. And most of you know this. So, but when it comes to things like racism, things like sexism, for example, from the 1960s to now, 1960s, this is the era when many countries, especially in Africa, decolonized. Many European imperial powers were leaving. That was the heart of civil rights movement in the U.S. So we have this idea that things have changed. But some scholars would say, what has changed is the language through which we say things. We don't say things openly. We say it differently. Someone can write a letter to you, or if you apply for a job, for example, in the 1950s, they would tell an African American, we don't hire Negroes, or they would say bluntly, we don't hire niggers, or they would say we don't want niggers here. That's what they used to say. It was blatant. It was openly, done. After the 1960s, when segregation became illegal and Americans were forced to desegregate by law, they understood. They knew that they did not want segregation. They did not want desegregation. They wanted to remain segregated. But because it was passed as a law, they couldn't do anything. So what would you do? You switch to a different discourse. You do the same thing, but differently. Now, if you look at the US, and that's something Malcolm X actually talked about in the 1960s, and he said, it's not only the South, because the civil rights issues were concentrated in the South, and people thought the South was the most racist, the most segregated. And he said, no, the northern states were more segregated than in the South. Because during slavery, the slaves and the masters lived together. There were issues of hierarchy, the slaves knew their place, but they lived together. In the North, that wasn't the case. So when he said, if you want to change society, don't change society by law. You change society by changing the mindset of the people. But if you don't change the mindset of the people, you're doing nothing. So now, even today, America is still segregated. But how do they put it? They use a language that obscures the issue of race. For example, there's this professor at the University of Toronto called David Hulchanski, I think that's his name. He does research in urban areas, issues of distribution of wealth by neighborhoods and race. So he released some research, I think, about 2 years ago, and there was an article on Toronto Star with the title, "The Color of Money is White." So one of the things David said is that most of the wealthy neighborhoods in Toronto are mostly people of European descent, otherwise called white. So they are mostly white areas. But he used a different explanation. So he said, David said, the reason why these areas are mostly populated by people of European descent is because they have wealth and money buys the buy, what you can afford. So he said people move to areas they can afford. So to him, it's not something to do with racism. It's just these people have money and they can afford. Now, there's another professor at York called Carl James. And Carl James said, oh, that's not an explanation. You cannot simply say that is the issue of just money, that they can easily afford. He said, no, you have to look at the reason why actually people cannot afford. That's one. The second thing he's saying, even people who can afford to buy houses in those areas are discriminated by real estate agents, or they're sabotaged by people in the area not to be allowed to come into the area. So he said it's not just a question of money, but David is saying, no, it's a question of money. If you can afford it, you can live anywhere. Oh, Carl is saying, no, that's not true. So they use the language to convey. It's the same research that's being conveyed differently. So discourse has a lot of impact, and it because of language. So language is not just something you use to communicate. It's something you use to do things. To do things. So think about when you talk to your friends. The language you use with your friends, the language you use with your teacher, with your co-workers, or your partner, they're very different. So because language is context is specific. So discourse analysis is the study of language in use.